Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope you're doing well. This is going to be my August Marginalia video, so the different articles, essays, poems, short stories that I read in the month of August that I didn't really post any separate videos on. Usually they connect to something I was reading. And then at the end I'll throw in a quick music recommendation based on some of the stuff I read in August. So August was a busy month for me, as I'm sure for many, but as we started up school, virtual learning is different, but we were still onboarding students, getting kids ready, and finding some successes with learning, which has been very encouraging for me, and I hope for all the families and students I'm working with. But the first story I'll talk about is The Overcoat by Nikolai Gogol, an outstanding story. It was a reread for me. It captures the satire of the Russian bureaucracy, the St. Petersburg bureaucracy in the 19th century that Gogol is justly famous for. But it also has those interesting, like, sort of supernatural elements that Gogol also can pull off so well. Supernatural satire. It's fantastic. The Codex Continued an outstanding video on this. I'm going to link that in the description box below. But I wanted to share sort of my one annotation to that, which is that throughout the story there's this idea of, like, you have to go through up the chain of the bureaucracy and like keep passing the complaint up. And I suspect that at the end there's a supernatural occurrence that I think also mirrors that, like, working up the chain. That's the Jack annotation. I also read The Ballad of Black Time by Victor LaValle. Absolutely loved it. As part of that, I reread The Horror at Red Hook by H.P. Lovecraft in the Brooklyn Noir 2. I don't find that one of H.P. Lovecraft's strongest horror stories, but I knew that there was deep intertextuality between the original story and LaValle's Ballad of Black Time. Loved Ballad of Black Time. Let's see. One of the books I read in August was the Augustus Along 12 Caesars by Suetonius. Had a lot of fun with that. And as part of my work on that, I also read Tacitus's biography of his father-in-law, Agricola, which was written sort of contemporaneously with the end of the Flavian dynasty, and it just has this absolutely famous line in Agricola: "They make a desert and call it peace," and it's stunning. Also worked through. I'm continuing to read selections from the Library of America's Future is Female, which is science fiction stories written pre-1970. By female authors, and a number of them have been really interesting. The one I sat down and really focused on in August was one called Created He Them by Alice Eleanor Jones. I highly recommend it. I'm going to try and find a PDF that I can link that I can throw into the description box. But it's set in what I regard as like a post-nuclear apocalypse dystopia where not every human can produce viable offspring. And so there's just this sadness for the families that can have children. There's this deep sadness, that where everybody's clustering around the babies, just as happens in real life. People cluster around a baby and they're so excited, and how poignant that is when that becomes a very rare occurrence. And this sort of hovering of well, what happens, you don't see any teens running around, so something's going on. So it is a very effective story, and I continue to enjoy the stories from this volume. The other one, I read The Sound and the Fury in August, and I have one more video on that coming up, but I read a couple of different texts that sort of connect to that. So one of those was, there's a connection to the Jason Compsons, which is that their middle name is Lycurgus. So I read Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, the famous Spartan lawgiver, who has some interesting laws. I don't know how well I would do in Sparta. I also read Paul's Mistress by Guy de Maupassant. It's not actually in this volume. I've never found it in print. I have an online edition that I've perused. And that just connects so well. The story of Paul Baron in Paul's Mistress connects so well with Section 2 in The Sound and the Fury and Quentin Compson. And the idea, sort of the ending of Quentin's section in The Sound and the Fury, and also sort of some of the quixotic romantic obsessions he has. So an excellent story by Maupassant. And then sort of to balance Faulkner, I read a couple of stories by Charles Chestnut, who was writing in the late 19th century and was in the interesting position of living in, experiencing both the North and Southern United States and Jim Crow, in the South, but also really finding success as a businessman, and then working to try and find success as a writer. He was a contemporary of W.E.B. Du Bois, and he wrote a number of short stories that are set on set circa 1880, when a white family moves down to North Carolina after Reconstruction, and they are told stories by an old man who grew up as a slave, whose name is Julius, and they're considered conjure tales. But within them, Chestnut really pulls out the stops to show, okay, you have the sort of the folktale aspect, you have this interesting supernatural aspect of like conjuring, but you also have slavery and how absolutely horrifying and scary that is on top of it. So I read the Goophered, Grapevine, and Post Sandy, and I'm probably going to do a video on Post Sandy because I think it encapsulates some really interesting themes that juxtapose so well with whenever you're reading sort of those works set in the southern United States during that era. Let's see. Oh, I am continuing, of course, to work through the Reporting Civil Rights, and I guess the main thing I'll say is as the journalism progresses into the later 1950s, more and more of the journalism begins to be written by white reporters or white journalists in sort of like mainstream magazines, mainstream newspapers. It's no longer restricted to the reporting done by black journalists and black writers. They're still represented, they're still very common, but you can see that there's this growth and wider consciousness within the United States growing as the 1950s progress, and that was interesting. The last thing I'll jump into, I was working sort of on a series of readings from the Deuteronomy school in the Old Testament of the Bible, or the Hebrew Bible. And so I had finished Deuteronomy and Lamentations, and I'm almost finished with the book of Jeremiah. But I'm also preparing to dive into Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison in September. And so I know that it has much more intertextuality with Genesis, which I'm going to reread, but I'm also going to reread the Song of Songs, which has much less intertextuality with Morrison's novel. And I read an interesting article by, I think it must have been Harold Bloom, talking about the idea of the book of Jonah and the great fish in Jonah, and then Moby Dick, and this idea of how the whiteness of the white whale of Moby Dick has this interesting reading of it for writers who are growing up in the United States who aren't white and who see that like monolithic culture that they're trying to write within or write around. And it was an interesting article. And so as I was thinking through it, I went and reread the book of Jonah, and then with Jonah asked to go prophesy at Nineveh, I went and read the book of Nahum, which is about the destruction of Nineveh. And Nahum, of course, is just this like incredible, like just singular prophecy that it just pushes through. So that was my reading in August. It was interesting. I don't know if any of you have read any of those texts before. Feel free to comment if you do. In terms of the music recommendations, if you're spending a month reading Faulkner, you probably might be interested in listening to some of those Delta blues musicians. So I listened to Robert Johnson. I also listened to some blues musicians from outside the Delta, like Sonny Boy Williamson or Blind Willie McTell. But then the sort of my favorite, like unheard of Delta blues musician are the Mississippi Sheiks. So I'm going to throw a link to Sitting on Top of the World, which was a great song they did, later covered by the Grateful Dead in sort of a revved up acid freak out. And then from that blues, I went and listened to Electric Flag. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of them. They put out a couple of albums in the late 60s and had Mike Bloomfield, who is an outstanding blues guitarist from Chicago. He was sort of their leader of the band and their like musical guide on that first album, and pushed them forward. And so I'll probably link one or two songs by Electric Flag as well. So that was August for me. Thanks, everyone.